Every ancient metropolis believes its walls will stand forever. They trust completely in the illusion of their own divine permanence. They build their sacred gates to withstand the end of the world. But history is a graveyard of eternal empires. In the year 539 BCE, the absolute center of human civilization faced an unimaginable threat. A rising empire arrived at the borders of Babylon, carrying the momentum to crush everything in its path. Yet the most shocking event of this conquest was not a massacre. It was the deliberate, chilling refusal to light the match. This is not just the story of a city changing hands. It is a timeless warning about how an empire can weaponize mercy to absorb an entire civilization. And it reveals the terrifying genius of a conqueror who knew that the ultimate victory is not to burn a world, but to inherit it. Chapter 1. The City That Should Have Burned. Babylon was a city so heavy with memory, a city of processional roads and temple towers, a city of walls so immense that later ages struggled to describe them without drifting toward wonder. A city where kings did not merely govern men, but claimed to stand inside the order of the cosmos. For most of ancient history, the fall of a great city carried a familiar grammar: walls broken, temples plundered, populations slaughtered or driven away. Victory had to be seen. It had to be written in smoke. But when Cyrus of Persia entered those immense gates, he presented something entirely different. Not the ruin of Babylon, but its preservation. Not the humiliation of its gods, but their restoration to honor. Not the obliteration of an old political world, but its absorption into a new imperial order. This did not mean the conquest was gentle in every place. The campaign that broke Babylonian power involved battle, flight, and the collapse of resistance. Nor does it mean that royal inscriptions are innocent reports. They were arguments in clay crafted to justify rule. Even so, the argument itself matters, because it reveals what Cyrus wanted conquest to mean. He wanted to be seen not simply as a destroyer who had won, but as a restorer who had been chosen. This is why Babylon matters beyond the date. The capture of the city was one of history's clearest demonstrations that empire could be built through continuity as well as shock. That power could deepen itself by stepping into old sanctities instead of crushing them. To understand why Babylon did not burn, we have to begin with the world that made Babylon worth preserving. Chapter 2. Babylon, Before the Fall. Long before Cyrus approached its horizon, Babylon had already become more than a capital. It was a sacred landscape arranged around power. The Euphrates moved through it like an artery. Temples rose from mud brick and bitumen with the authority of old ritual. The great city was tied to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, and through him to the annual renewal of kingship itself. To rule Babylon was not merely to occupy a palace, it was to enter a living ceremonial order. The city had inherited the prestige of ancient Mesopotamia. Its scribes carried deep archives of memory. Its priesthood guarded rights older than many kingdoms. Its monuments told every visitor that this was not a frontier city to be seized and forgotten. This was one of the civilizational centers of the world. And yet by the 6th century BCE, beneath the brilliance of Babylonian kingship, strain had begun to gather. The Neo-Babylonian Empire had risen in the ruins of Assyrian domination. It had produced formidable rulers, among them Nebuchadnezzar II, whose name remained attached to conquest, fortification, and monumental building. But empires are rarely inherited in full strength. By the time Nabonidus came to the throne in 5050 ZE, Babylon was still imposing, still wealthy, still feared. Yet the equilibrium between court, priesthood, and capital was becoming less secure. Nabonidus is one of those rulers whose reign survives in a haze of policy, piety, and controversy. Modern historians do not reduce him to a simple caricature, but the surviving evidence strongly suggests that his relationship with Babylon's religious establishment was troubled. His devotion appears to have leaned heavily toward the moon god Sin. His long absence from Babylon, especially his extended stay in Tema in Arabia, also strained the symbolic obligations of kingship in the capital. A Mesopotamian king could not easily detach himself from the ritual center that legitimized him. Distance was not just administrative, it was theological. The later Persian presentation of Nabonidus made full use of this weakness. In that account, he is portrayed as impious, disordering cult practice, neglecting the proper worship of Marduk, and alienating the Citians' sacred order. We should read that portrait carefully. It was written by the victors. It tells us as much about Persian political needs as it does about Nabonidus himself. Still, propaganda only works when it can attach itself to existing anxiety. Cyrus did not invent Babylon's internal tensions, he exploited them. This matters because cities do not fall only at their walls, they also fall in the realm of legitimacy. If the elites who interpret the Citian sacred order can be convinced that a conqueror is a corrective rather than a profaner, then resistance changes shape. A siege becomes a transfer, an invasion becomes a restoration. Babylon in 5039 BCE was still magnificent, but magnificence is not immunity. The Citians' walls could defend space. They could not by themselves defend a broken relationship between ruler and sacred center. And beyond Babylon, another power was rising with unnerving speed. Chapter 3. The Making of Cyrus. Cyrus did not emerge from emptiness. He emerged from a world of Iranian tribes, old kingdoms, and unstable hierarchies in which the Persians had once stood below the Medes. The details of his early life are tangled in later tradition. Greek authors would surround him with stories of exposure, destiny, and royal drama. Those traditions shaped his legend, but they are not the firm ground of this story. What matters historically is that Cyrus, ruler of the Persians, overthrew the Median king Astyages, and in doing so transformed Persia from a subordinate people into the nucleus of a growing empire. That alone would have altered the map of the Near East. But Cyrus did not stop there. He advanced westward and defeated Croesus of Lydia, bringing one of the richest kingdoms of Anatolia under Persian control. With Media and Lydia absorbed, Cyrus stood at the head of a state that was no longer regional. It was becoming imperial in scale and imagination. Roads, tributes, subject peoples, old courts, and inherited administrative traditions began to gather under Persian authority. This is one reason Babylon must not be treated as an isolated episode. By the time Cyrus turned toward Mesopotamia, he had already shown a striking capacity to conquer established powers and convert them into components of a larger order. He was not merely a destroyer in search of plunder. He was building a machine that could absorb civilizations. That quality is visible in the Babylon story from the start. Because the question was never only whether Cyrus could defeat Babylon militarily, it was whether he could master the meaning of Babylon. The city was too symbolically charged to be treated like a camp taken in the field. To possess Babylon was to lay claim to the heritage of Mesopotamian kingship. To misuse it was to risk endless unrest in one of the richest and most literate regions in the empire to be. Cyrus, or those who governed in his name, appear to have understood this with unusual clarity. Later, Persian kings would call themselves kings of many lands, but Babylon was one of the great titles that made such language credible. To stand in Babylon was to stand in a chain of rule that stretched backward through Assyria, Chaldea, and the older worlds of Sumer and Akkad. This is why the conquest of 539 BCE was not just territorial. It was civilizational. And like many civilizational victories, it would depend as much on symbolism as on steel. Before Babylon could be entered, it had to be isolated. Before it could be preserved, its defenders had to be broken somewhere else. Chapter 4. The Road to Babylon. The campaign of 539 BCE unfolded with a speed that still feels unsettling. Babylon appears in memory as a city of near-mythic impregnability. But empires often collapse, not at the final wall, but along the roads that feed the wall, the river routes that sustain it, and the morale of the men sent out to defend it. The Nabonidus Chronicle, one of the crucial near-contemporary records for these events, gives the campaign in terse, almost severe lines. That brevity is part of its force. It does not stage the fall as epic theater. It records the unmaking of a regime. In the month of Tashritu, Cyrus's forces fought the Babylonians at Opis on the Tigris. The encounter was decisive, and the army of Akkad was defeated. The water of the Tigris turned dark as the blood of the defenders was spilled in the field. Steel clashed against bronze in a frantic struggle that left the Babylonian resistance badly damaged. There are indications of great violence in the aftermath, recorded in the severe lines of the chronicle. The screams of the defeated echoed briefly before the capital itself began its quick disintegration. When a great capital falls quickly, later generations often search for hidden mechanisms. Herodotus and Xenophon preserved traditions involving engineering, river diversion, and a dramatic nighttime entry. These accounts are famous, but modern scholarship treats them with caution. The contemporary record suggests that the military collapse of Babylonian resistance preceded the ceremonial mastery of the city. By the time Persian authority entered the city, the war for Babylon had largely been won outside it. The decisive blows had fallen in the field. The capital was no longer the site where the outcome would be decided. It had become the place where the outcome would be interpreted, and interpretation was now everything. A city like Babylon could not simply be occupied. It had to be narrated back into order. Someone had to explain why Marduk had allowed this. Someone had to explain why the old king had failed. Someone had to explain why a Persian should now wear the mantle of Mesopotamian legitimacy. The conqueror who understood that was already ruling before the coronation began. Chapter 5. Conquest without a sack. There is a sentence associated with the fall of Babylon that has echoed for generations. The city, in the Persian presentation, was entered without battle. At first hearing, the phrase sounds almost impossible. A great imperial capital changes masters, and yet the language of the event is one of calm. We should not mistake that phrase for simple transparency. It is political language, telling us how Cyrus's rule wished to appear. The cylinder presents Cyrus as the chosen instrument of Marduk, welcomed into Babylon in peace and joy. The chronicle records a sequence that suggests control and transition rather than a spectacular sack. The deeper point is that the conquest was framed around order. Order restored. Order recognized by the gods. Order made visible through restraint. That restraint was not an act of sentiment, but a form of power. A ruined Babylon would have been a warning, but a preserved Babylon allowed Cyrus to broadcast a different message. He did not need the city in ashes to prove its defeat. The symbolism of his peaceful entry mattered to subject peoples far beyond Mesopotamia. A conqueror who raises one sacred center announces that no inheritance is safe. A conqueror who restores temples announces that the old world may continue, but only through him. Even the mercy of empire can be possessive. This was not conquest stripped of ideology. It was conquest refined into ideology. He was teaching the conquered how to survive under him. Chapter 6. The Persian Method. The capture of Babylon becomes most important when we stop treating it as an exception and begin to see it as a method. Persian rule developed a distinctive capacity to govern through inherited structures and local elites. This was not tolerance in a modern moral sense, it was imperial intelligence. The Cyrus cylinder gives this method a ceremonial voice. Cyrus is not presented as a foreign despoiler who imposes alien gods on a defeated people. He is the ruler chosen by Marduk to restore justice and return displaced divine images to their sanctuaries. That language is thoroughly Mesopotamian in form. It is the voice of a new master learning to speak Babylonian legitimacy better than the old one. Persia did not need to persuade Babylonia to forget itself. It needed Babylonia to continue functioning in a Persian key. Temples mattered for this, as did priests, titles, and ceremony. Empires that underestimate ritual often discover that force cannot easily replace meaning. An old city is easiest to rule when its sacred grammar is not humiliated in public. This did not abolish hierarchy, it intensified it. Babylon could keep its memory, but now that memory ratified Persian power. Its temples could stand, but under a king who had not been born within their walls. Its rituals could continue because the conqueror now presented himself as their rightful guardian. In that sense, preservation itself became a political technology, and it was scalable. An empire built only by devastation exhausts itself. An empire that can inherit administrative habits from the worlds it conquers can expand much farther. Babylon was one of the finest tests of that principle. If Persia could absorb Babylon, then Persia was no longer simply a victorious kingdom from the Iranian plateau. It was becoming a universal empire in the ancient Near Eastern sense, a state capable of taking old centers of civilization and turning them into pillars of its own permanence. That was the Persian method at its most formidable, not just to conquer the world, but to inherit it. Chapter 7. A City Preserved, an Empire Enlarged. After 539 BCE, Babylon did not vanish into the silence that follows obliteration. It continued as a major urban and administrative center under Persian rule. That continuity was itself a declaration. The Persians had not come to extinguish one of the great capitals of the ancient world. They had come to possess it. In practical terms, this mattered enormously. A functioning Babylon meant immediate access to a highly developed bureaucracy. Scribal expertise, agricultural wealth, and a strategic geographic position were all preserved. By keeping the city's infrastructure intact, the Persians secured a massive economic engine. Its granaries and revenues were redirected to fuel the new state. Cyrus had discovered a political technology that would change the nature of empire forever. By preserving what others revered, he invented the first form of what the modern world calls soft power. He understood that it is far easier to rule a city that still recognizes its own face in the mirror. Preservation was not an act of sentiment, but a tool of strategic maturity. The quiet transfer of institutions can change the world more thoroughly than the roar of destruction. To occupy that world without wrecking it was strategic maturity. No empire of this size could escape tension, but Babylon still stands as a foundational demonstration. An empire that could lay claim to Babylon could claim more than land. It could claim succession. Succession, in the ancient world, was often stronger than brute novelty. To appear as the rightful continuation of old kings was far more powerful. This is what Cyrus achieved. A conquest translated into legitimacy, so the city could begin to help sustain the empire that had taken it. Chapter 8. Memory in Clay and Scripture. The final power of Babylonia's fall lies in the way it was remembered, not only as an event, but as an image pressed into clay, an image of a conqueror who entered a great city and left it standing. The Cyrus cylinder became central to that memory. It was an ancient royal inscription designed to legitimize a new king in Babylonian terms. The clay of the cylinder carries his voice across 25 centuries. I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, legitimate king, king of Babylon. My vast army moved about Babylon in peace. I did not allow anyone to frighten the people of Sumer and Akkad. I sought the welfare of the city and all its sanctuaries. These words were the architecture of a new kind of power. Cyrus could have glorified destruction, but he chose to glorify restoration. That choice echoes far beyond the tablet itself. In later tradition, Cyrus would be remembered as the ruler who allowed exiles to return and temples to be rebuilt. In modern times, he has often been recast as a model of ancient tolerance. Memory enlarged him because the event itself had been staged for enlargement. Babylon was not only conquered, it was narratively transformed. A ruler who understood that the strongest empire is one that preserves what others revere. He then placed that reverence in his own service. Its survival was part of the conquest. Cyrus took the city by defeating its kingdom. He kept the city by inhabiting its meaning. A style of rule in which empire did not merely advance over the ruins of the old world. It advanced by claiming to complete it. So the silence after Babylonia's fall was not the silence of ash drifting over broken walls. It was the quieter silence of succession. The gates still stood, and the sanctuaries still breathed incense. Babylon remained Babylon. And that was precisely why Persia had won.